Very, very warm welcome. Thanks very much for joining us. My name's Andrew Thynne, Chairman of the Scottish Land Commission, have been since we were established. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this evening and what we're trying to do here in a minute. But first of all, I just want to introduce the other people from the Land Commission who are with me. So I'm just going to, and I'm just doing this in the order I can see them on the screen. So forgive me if I cause offence. Cathy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, I'm Cathy Pollard. I'm a Policy Officer at the Scottish Land Commission.
Thank you, Cathy. David, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, good evening, everyone. I'm David Adams. I'm one of the commissioners. I'm also Emeritus Professor in Urban Studies at the University of Glasgow, where I spent a good proportion of my academic career. I'm particularly interested in urban land ownership, in issues around housing, development, and vacant and derelict land.
Thank you, David. One of the finest universities in the world, I think. And last but not least at all, Lorne, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. My name's Lorne MacLeod, one of the commissioners. Prior to joining the commission, I was chair of Community Land Scotland, which is the representative body for community landowners in Scotland. And I was 6 years on the board of the Isle of Gia buyout, and also thereafter 6 years co-opted on the board of the South Uist Eriskay and Benbecula buyout in the Western Isles. So my background is very much rural, but I strongly believe that land reform is of equal importance to urban areas. So very much looking forward to the questions and discussion later on this evening. Thank you.
Lorne, thanks very much. So that's the mix of us with you this evening. Of course, there are other people on the other land commissioners, are there other experts on the staff as well. So we're a pretty mixed bunch, and we live all over the country as well, of course. Before the pandemic, we used to hold public meetings every month, and the board attached a really high level of importance to that. It was one of our signatures, if you like. And those public meetings were hugely important in the early days. They shaped the initial set of priorities. They shaped the programs, the work programs that we worked on over the first 2 or 3 years. They were really important. And then at the end of 3 years, we set out a new program, which we're now working on. And again, that was shaped by these public meetings. So they've been massively important. And they will continue to be important because the Commission will continue, at least so long as I'm in the chair, to hold public meetings every month and to use what we hear at those meetings to shape what we do. The format that we used in village halls is pretty much the format we're using here, not exactly, but more or less. And as soon as we can, of course, we'll go back to face-to-face public meetings. But actually, these online ones do allow people to attend who might have struggled to make the village hall one. So there's a strength in this. But the format is that we will have a quick run through, a gallop actually, if that's all right, Lorne, a gallop through our work program and what we're doing and all the rest of it. And Lorne's going to do that, and he'll do it with some slides on the screen. And then we'll open it up to discussion. We want to have a discussion with you. And in order to do that, we're going to use the chat function, which actually works pretty well. So what we'll be asking you to do once Lorne's finished his presentation, or indeed before, if you wish, is to just type your thoughts in there, or your questions if you want to ask questions. But it's as much about your thoughts. And equally, if you want to offer thoughts on other people's thoughts, chuck them into the chat function. There's a button, you'll see it, but there's a button there, and you can just type straight into a box there, and we can all see it. What I will try and do is, as the chat is moving up the screen, I will extract questions and themes from that and ask members of the panel, Lorne, David, Cathy, to offer their thoughts on those particular themes. So that there will be a kind of Q&A, if you like, discussion going on at the same time as the chat function is working. So I'll repeat all that after we've heard from Lorne. So if you didn't understand what I said, don't worry, I'll repeat it again. But I think now I'm going to go straight to Lorne. Lorne, would you like to just give us your wee presentation? And this is really just to help everybody to have a good overview of what we're doing at the moment, what we're trying to do, it's not going to go into high levels of detail. We'll try and do that in the chat if you want us to. Lauren, over to you.
Well, thanks for that, Andrew. As Andrew said, this is a quick overview. I'm sort of looking at the last 3 years of our work and looking forward to the next 3 years. First of all, what is land reform? Well, land reform can be defined as a process of change to laws, regulations and customs regarding land ownership and use, and it's very much central to the big public policy challenges of today, like climate change, productivity, inclusion, post-COVID recovery. Why does it matter? Well, Scotland has one of the most concentrated land ownership patterns in the world. 50% of Scotland's privately owned rural land is in the hands of just over 400 owners. That's just 0.008% of Scotland's population total. How land is owned and used and who benefits from those arrangements is important to economic and community development being undertaken in a socially just way. The Scottish Land Commission was established following the passing of the Land Reform Act 2016 and was set in pace, as it were, 2017. There are 5 land commissioners and 1 tenant farming commissioner, supported by a small team of core staff. Our role is to stimulate fresh thinking and change in how Scotland owns and uses land, and to advise the Scottish Government on an ongoing programme of land reform, as well as providing advice and recommendations for law and policy reform. We provide leadership for change in culture and behaviour. Much of our work is underpinned by Scotland's Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. Now, this statement was one of the outcomes of the Land Reform Act 2016, and is the first of its kind in the world in terms of setting out the relationship between land reform and human rights, recognising that along with rights to own land come responsibilities to your neighbours, to your community and the wider public good. Property rights used to be perceived as a barrier to land reform, but Scotland is now moving in line with the rest of the world in recognising that human rights can actually be a springboard for progressing land reform, and that land reform itself can help fulfil our human rights obligations. Now, in showing you this slide, I am wanting to give you a flavour of the work we have undertaken since moving on to talk about the work we will take forward in the next 3 years. So, taking from the top of the slide there, concentration of land ownership. We published proposals in 2019 to address the impact of Scotland's highly concentrated pattern of private land ownership, including proposing a public interest test for land ownership of scale. We have now published legislative proposals on this subject at the start of this year. Moving down to vacant and derelict land, a major focus in the past 3 years has been on vacant and derelict land. There remains 11,000 hectares of these sites across Scotland. That's roughly equivalent to twice the size of the city of Dundee, and causing a significant blight on local communities and missed opportunities of not using that land more productively. Together with the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, we established the Vacant and Derelict Land Task Force, which has brought national attention to this issue, and we have published recommendations to bring back land into productive use. And I know Kathy knows a lot about this because she was heavily involved in that particular initiative. A land value sharing. We have advised the government on how the uplift value of land created by public investments, for example, improvements in infrastructure or planning permission, could be more effectively shared between private developers and society. David's the expert on that one. Land for housing. We've also undertaken a wide-ranging review of how land is being made available for housing and for development projects. This started at the end of 2019. recognising that we needed a fundamental change in how land is made available for housing if we want to create places that people want to live in at prices they can afford, and we will report on the results of this work to ministers soon. A good practice programme. All of our work is underpinned by the government's land rights and responsibility statement. So we've invested a lot of time to develop guidance and protocols, as well as working with different types of landowners and communities around what changes are needed in practice on the ground. We've actually published 8 protocols so far. We have published advice to government on regional land use partnerships, which build on the land use strategy and the land rights and responsibility statement, and 5 pilot areas have been announced to take forward the partnerships. Finally, and by no means least, is the work of our Tenant Farming Commissioner, whose role is to improve relationships between tenant farmers and landowners. Moving on to the next 3 years of our work now, our new strategic plan and detailed programme of work are available on our website, and you can see our 3 priorities listed on the slide. The work on reforming land rights will contribute in particular to Scotland's ambitions for repopulating rural areas, ensuring land is more easily available for housing and infrastructure, increasing community ownership of land and buildings, community wealth building, and supporting our wider economic recovery and renewal. Within this work stream, we shall be looking at how we can have more diverse land ownership, and we shall also be identifying new governance models for owning land, possible hybrid governance models, and also managing our common good land. This is the opportunity for a brief small advert here. A community ownership hub has been set up by Community Land Scotland for Glasgow and the Clyde Valley, and this will promote community ownership in the area. There is a website, you maybe see that there, www.communityownership.scot, and there are advisors who can help steer communities along the path to community ownership. The second work stream is responsible land ownership and use, with the aim of making sure that whoever owns or uses land are doing it in a way which is more responsible and accountable to local communities and the public benefit. We are continuing to invest a lot of resources in helping landowners of all types and local communities adopt and implement the land rights and responsibility statement. We are also looking at how the statement could be mainstreamed within local authorities, public agencies, and also the private sector. Our work also involves advising the government on the land use strategy and the guidance on community engagement in land use decision making. Our third and final work stream is reforming land markets. We see land values as being critical for many of the issues that land reform aims to deal with. For example, how land is used productively and how more people can benefit from owning or using land. Land values have increased more than 450% since 1995. They are now valued, this is across the United Kingdom, at £5 trillion. This has led many people to question how the benefits from increasing land values are distributed and whether more needs to be done to ensure that the gains from rising land values benefit society as a whole. Part of the answer to how we derive greater public benefit from changing land values are tax and fiscal frameworks. We have set up a tax advisory group to work with us in looking in greater depth at tax reforms in relation to land. And we are also looking at more practical options for reforming land markets to enable land to better deliver public benefit. Now moving on to Tenant Farming Commissioner. The role of the Tenant Farming Commissioner was created following the 2016 Land Reform Act, and the role is to encourage and promote good relations between farming tenants and landlords. You can see much of the activity outlined in the slide there, but I don't intend to go through them in detail, as our focus for this evening is on the City of Glasgow. So thank you for listening. I hope this has helped you understand who we are, what we've done in the past 3 years, and what our focus will be for the next 3 years. And with that, I'll pass back to Andrew, our chair.
Lauren, thank you very much indeed. There's a huge amount of work going on in the Land Commission, and it's very, very difficult to do that quickly, and Lauren has done an excellent job for us. Now, just before I open this up through the chat, I'm conscious, just watching the numbers on the screen, that a number of people have joined us in the last 5 or 10 minutes. So I'm just going to reiterate again what we're trying to do here. First of all, though, can I just remind everybody this is being recorded. It will be available online for anyone who wants to look at it again, or anyone who's not been able to see it in the first place. So just be aware of that, please. What we're trying to do here is to have a conversation with you to try and understand how you see things, what you think the priorities are, and so on. And that will inform our future program of work, our future priorities, and all the rest of it. So this is not just a question and answer. I do really want to hear your views, please. In order to do that, we're going to use this thing called the chat function. There's a button probably at the bottom of your screen. It'll just say chat with a wee bubble. If you click on that, then a pane comes up and you can type into it your thoughts. By all means, type questions into that. By all means, type in thoughts about what you heard from Lauren or what you're going to hear from us. By all means, type your thoughts on what other people have typed. It's a conversation. It's a sharing of views. It will help to inform us. I will try to distill out of what's coming through the chat thoughts, questions, themes that the panel can then offer some more in-depth thinking about. And I'm going to start that in a minute. You will see, and you already have seen, in fact, that we've very helpfully got behind the scenes 2 of our staff, Posey and Jess, and they're putting up links so that you can follow up in more detail if you want, all sorts of things. Don't worry about this. If you can't copy those links down, don't worry, because this is all recorded. You can get it later. Pretty much all the links will be through our website anyway, and can be found by navigating the website. And last but not least, I will finish this by 8:30. It's now just after 7:15. I will finish at 8:30. Now, there's already a number of things come through the chat, so I'm going to go straight into those, but please add to them. Please don't go too fast, or I'll struggle to keep up with you. But the first theme and subject is vacant and derelict land. So Matthew's wanting to. Matthew, please just type the specifics of your question and I'll try and get an answer for you. But the previous point that came in from Alistair MacDonald, and thank you, Alistair, for that, is really specifically about vacant derelict land and housing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go first of all to David Adams, professor at Glasgow University, worked on this for many years in great depth. David, some general thoughts. So there's a specific there about vacant and derelict land availability for housing and development, but wider thoughts, if you wish, on vacant and derelict land in the context of Glasgow that you think would be helpful for people to think about, and we'll get Matthew's specific question in a second. Over to you, David, to start, please.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me just start with the general, which is vacant derelict land has, as I've mentioned previously, been a real focus of what the Commission has been doing in its first few years. And there's been a whole series of research projects undertaken. Significant ones are about the impact on communities, the very negative impact on communities of vacant and derelict land, because that evidence has been needed to be highlighted. looking at the way in which financial appraisals take place to sort of broaden out the factors that might be appropriate in assessing whether it's worthwhile to go ahead with projects on vacant derelict land. And most importantly, a very significant landmark report by the task force to the government. And one of the key elements that resulted from that is the £50 million fund announced just before December by the Scottish Government, and invitations to projects have been released recently. So I think it's fair to say that people are thinking a lot more about vacant and derelict land and how to solve it than was the case a few years ago. So let me move on to the very specific and I think really quite important question that Alistair has raised. Because in the past, the focus on urban land was very often on its planning status as to whether, for example, housing was or was not allowed. I think what the research of the Commission and others has shown is that the role of the landowner, the person who owns the land, is really quite crucial as to what happens. And I think if we look at pieces of land that have been, whether large or small, that have been unused for a very long period of time, we find what we call passive ownership. Often people are sitting on pieces of land with no huge plans and frustrating what might otherwise happen. So a key challenge in land reform for urban areas is to find new mechanisms to move land from passive ownership to active ownership. That may well be communities. It may well be small-scale entrepreneurs. It may be housing associations. A whole series of different organisations can actually be quite creative in a way that existing owners might not be. So I just want to indicate 3 areas of work that the Commission has been involved in. And there are many others, but just to illustrate the kind of land reform mechanisms that might prompt a change of ownership and actually might prompt something to happen on the sites that have been vacant or derelict for a very long period of time. The first is our proposal for compulsory sale orders. And this was submitted to the Scottish Government in 2018 and was actually reflected in the manifestos both of the SNP and the Green Party, and to a lesser extent of the Conservative Party as well in the 2021 Scottish election. So the principle here is that there comes a time when we say it's no longer in the public interest for someone to hold on to land without doing anything about it, and mechanisms were put in place to enable local authorities to require land to be sold by public auction. The second area is around tax. Lorne may want to say a bit more about this, but an issue that perhaps could be explored is the holding costs of keeping land vacant. As a land reform measure, should a tax be imposed or a charge be imposed of some sort to cover the negative effect on communities of keeping your land vacant? In other words, rather than very few holding costs, people should have to pay into the community to cover the externalities. And the third area is the community right to buy, which has been reviewed and is being reviewed constantly by the Commission, but is the new community right to buy for abandoned, neglected and detrimental land, which is a compulsory right to buy. I have to say that so far there have not been any successful applications under that mechanism, but I know there are communities that are exploring how to make use of it. So I think the answer is that this is a real problem. It has been a real problem. It's not simply about planning. It's about finding new ways to prompt changes in land ownership, and through changes in land ownership, prompt reuse and redevelopment. And those are really important priorities for the Commission going forward.
David, thanks very much indeed. I've got a string of themes, so I'm going to have to just watch my timing here. But one specific question, are compulsory purchase orders a separate thing? Yes, they are. Compulsory sale orders, that, as recommended by us, are different from compulsory purchase orders which already exist. Now, there's a lot of stuff on our website which has been flagged up for you in the chat on vacant and derelict land. Just before we leave vacant and derelict land, though, it is a very important issue in Glasgow, a really big, serious issue. And the original question, actually from Alistair, was linked it to housing. I wonder, Kathy, if you wanted to say, offer some thoughts on land for housing more generally, or specifically linking it to VDL, I don't really mind, but I think it would be really helpful just to particularly tackle that aspect of the question.
Yeah, sure. I would just like to start with the definition actually of vacant and derelict land. And I suppose vacant and derelict land is set out in Scottish Government policy quite specifically, and we have a register of Scotland's vacant and derelict land. That's where we got the figure, almost 11,000 hectares of vacant and derelict land. But for land to have an impact on communities, it doesn't need to be designated as vacant or derelict, but it's really important to remember that unused land that isn't designated or isn't over 0.1 hectares of land, which is what it needs to be on the register, it can still have a really significant impact on communities. And therefore, we've done research, as David said, on looking at the consequences of living near such land on communities. And I think that's a really important point if you're looking at productive land use, because there's clearly sites and patches of land that are often in clusters in urban communities that have a really detrimental impact. And I think that's the land that we'd like to prioritise. So it doesn't need to be officially designated vacant derelict land, but there's a need to prioritise this land for a much better use. And this tool, I think the link has been shared, a community impact tool, is a really simple and straightforward way to engage with communities and to ensure that the land that is then put back into a use is productive. And that doesn't necessarily mean housing, but it really needs to be done with the community. I think that's a really important point to stress, that the land use is appropriate and reflects the needs and wants of the community. So that might be green space, that might be outdoor learning facilities, that might be housing or other productive uses. But the term productivity again is quite broad. So yeah, I just really wanted to flag that up. So there was another point that Alistair raised about land that's been unused for more than 50 years. So we've done a little bit more research based on that register, and we have identified what we're calling the dusties, the derelict urban sites since 2000 and earlier, and they're all mapped on our website. But essentially, there are almost 600 sites that have been derelict for 20, 30 years, and these are the sites that we'd like to see prioritised, but that doesn't necessarily mean that sites that aren't vacant or derelict or on the register should be prioritised for reuse. But again, helping identify that the need and harms of these sites, I think, is really key to bring them back into use.
Kathy, thank you. Just before we leave vacant and derelict, there's another question here about the governance and transparency of the register, and also a suggestion in the question that there's a lack of focus on rural areas in the VDL work, although I'm certainly aware of quite a lot of VDL sites in rural areas around where I live. But Kathy, just a quick, I don't know if you can see this question, I think it might have been sent direct to me, but essentially the question is, just how is this register policed? I mean, if a council, does the council have 100% discretion? Is there any sort of standards? How do you get onto it or not onto it? Or how do some councils have more or less? Just a quick word on that, Kathy, please.
Yeah, sure. So this is a centrally held register. So Scottish Government administers it. There's a survey that's undertaken every year by local authorities who can submit their sites to the register. So that's how it's updated. Sites need to be over 0.1 hectares. One of the proposals, recommendations by the Vacant Derelict Land Task Force was to actually look at that register and how it can be used to have a little bit more information about, say, ownership or the planning status, potential for naturalisation, just to really help that placemaking and that planning process. but yes, so it is held by government.
Okay, we may come back to VDL during the evening, but I'm conscious of the need to try and cover different things that different people want to discuss, and VDL could become very dominant. Just to be clear, we take the issue of vacant and derelict land, particularly in urban areas like Glasgow, very seriously, because it can be deeply damaging, deeply socially and economically damaging to have sizable chunks of vacant and derelict land. And in Glasgow, we certainly do. It is one of the highest, David will probably jump in if I get this wrong, but it certainly, I think, has one of the highest proportions of vacant and derelict land of any big conurbation in Western Europe. It's really a disgrace. And you look at the way other parts of Europe have managed to deal with this, we need to tackle it. So we take it really very seriously. We acknowledge it's not an easy problem. We acknowledge that at times it will be an expensive problem, and we're trying to find as many clever tools as we can. I don't think it's there's no easy switch, there's no silver bullet here, but it needs to be tackled. I want to move on now. There's a number of questions about communities engaging with landowners, landowners' decision makings, landowners who don't appear to be using their land very well, climate action and the way in which land use is used there. So the whole issue of land use decision making was an important theme of the last Land Reform Act in 2016, and community engagement in land use decision making was a very important theme. It's still got, I would suggest, a very long way to go. We are a long way from the intentions in that act, but I'm going to go to Lorne, if you wouldn't mind, Lorne, first, to just talk about the what is it that government is trying to do in terms of land use decision making and community engagement. What are our thoughts on it, and where might it go? Just drill into any of that you like, Lorne.
Okay. One of the things I think, and I've been scrolling through the chat box there, and there's obviously some of the points made are a frustration about a lack of the ability to maybe engage with some developers or various landowners. But one of the things that we have developed is a series of protocols which outline kind of best practice, good practice in relation to community engagement in relation to decisions on land. And this really comes from the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. So it'd be good, maybe one of my colleagues will flag up our web link to these protocols. And it really is about best practice, but these protocols at the moment do not have a legal underpinning. But similar to the work of a tenant farming commissioner, where there were sort of protocols that have developed into codes and have actually got a legal underpinning, there is a body of opinion out there that much of our work on protocols, perhaps if there is to be a new land reform bill in this new parliament, then some of that might be given kind of codes and backed up by legislation, which would maybe give more force to interaction with the developers. But again, much of the work on community engagement and land use decisions and interaction is very much about transparency. It's about communications with community councils, other community trusts, other groups. It's about having active discussions rather than maybe sort of some consultations which could be seen as, say, tokenistic. So I think we're wanting to develop the way and see improvements on the ground in that regard. And in fact, we have a team within the Scottish Land Commission that can help people with any individual problems, or at least signpost in the right direction in that regard. So I think community engagement is particularly important, and I think it is something that is very much developing, and as I say, may have a legal underpinning in due course. Thank you.
Lorne, thank you. Thank you. I wonder if we could just explore this a bit further, and I'm going to bring in David or Cathy. So there's no question what Parliament said in 2016 was loud and clear, that significant land use decisions should be taken in consultation with and through engagement with local people, local communities. And the reason for that is perfectly straightforward. Significant land use decisions impact other people, they impact communities. And it is perfectly reasonable, and in fact, it's just frankly plain good manners, that therefore those other people should be engaged in those decisions. You don't decide to do something that's going to impact on other people without talking to them first. So the logic of this is not complicated. Some landowners are brilliant at it, and some communities are really good at making it happen. But in many places, both need help, which is why we put a protocol together. But there is no doubt that there's still quite a long way to go, particularly, for example, with absentee landowners. I mean, some people who own land in Scotland live in Moscow or the Far East or wherever. I think maybe I could turn to you first, David. I mean, your experience of communities trying to influence land use. I will come on later to community right to buy. So if we could just focus on this engagement point first, and then I'll move on to the right to buy.
I think it's interesting, both in terms of communities trying to influence landowners who want to do something, and communities trying to influence landowners who are doing absolutely nothing. And both are really important. I think there's been a longer tradition, perhaps, in the planning sphere of and a more formal tradition of community engagement. And I think one of the issues that arises from that is the different objectives, often of landowners and communities. And the result can be no talking takes place and there's no agreed outcome. Actually, what the Commission is doing through the protocols and through our work on the ground is suggesting that actually some of these conflicts of interest can be resolved by clear liaison between communities and landowners. And it may well be that the local knowledge that communities have can actually be a benefit to landowners. Now, we all know there's successes in terms of community engagement, and there's often a very difficult path to be trod as well. What the Commission is doing is perhaps moving on simply beyond the requirements of the Planning Acts and saying that engagement is not simply about when development is proposed, it's about the management of land over a period of time. And I think that's also really important because sometimes actually just simply better management of urban land can solve a lot of the issues. So I think we're well aware that this is a well-trodden area. It's not easy to solve, but we are trying to come up with some very innovative mechanisms to promote better relations between communities and landowners, both in urban areas and rural areas.
David, thank you. There's some really useful, the chat's beginning to work now. People are making some really important points about the resources or lack of resources available to community councils, the framework of local democracy. All these things are really important, and you can look at them in international terms, of course, as well. So great. This is what we want to happen here. What is class? Good point from, sorry, I've lost who put that point is Martin Allen. What is local? What is community? Really important. So lots of difficult stuff here. I am going to just let this subject run a wee bit longer because it is a really important, particularly over the next 2 or 3 years. In the absence of further legislative land reform, cultural land reform, as one might call it, is where people's behaviours change, is going to be hugely important. Cathy, would you like to offer any further thoughts on this particular theme, please?
Yes, so we did some research last year on the value of early engagement with communities, and we particularly looked at the perspective of development and developers and looking at the benefits of from a landowner developer's point of view. And Nick Wright Planning and Stephen Tolson worked with us on that report. And we tried to quantify some of the benefits, to sort of look at sort of why it makes good business sense to engage early on with communities. And actually, the benefits are so much wider than that. It builds trust early on. It creates better outcomes. It's more collaborative. There's lots of benefits to doing early engagement with communities, not just when planning, when at the pre-application stage, but actually much earlier on when the concept of development is introduced. I think that's where that really comes to the fore, and it's extremely valuable to have that dialogue with communities. But we also need to start seeing it not just as a tick box, but this ongoing conversation with communities as part of a place. And I think there's a huge opportunity with the Planning Act, with local place plans to do that. So I think within the existing framework, we have a lot of opportunities. We just need to make sure that we are bringing the right the communities and all the stakeholders to the table when these decisions are made. And we've produced a set of resources that are online and case studies for examples of where this has been done really well by public bodies, by private developers and different organisations. So that's a really valuable set of resources.
Cathy, thank you. Let's shunt this on a bit and let's be prompted by Alistair McIntosh's comment in the chat, which is a really helpful one. Thank you, Alistair. So, clearly in the short term, we need, as I said, we are producing a lot of advice which will require legislative land reform, but we are also seeking to drive change through what I've crudely called cultural land reform. But let's talk about the legislative now. Both the SNP and the Greens have manifesto commitments to a land reform bill in this Parliament, so we can reasonably expect there to be a land reform act by, within 4 years or so. And we have obviously no idea at this point what will be in that. We're only just beginning to hear who our minister might be, but it's going to be hugely important. But we've already done a lot of work on this issue of power and power imbalance. And the bigger the holding and the more concentrated the holding, the greater that power imbalance. So it is not just about how many acres. If you own a whole island, even if the island is only 150 acres, you are in a very powerful position over the other people who happen to live on that island. I want to kick this off. I'm going to come back to Cathy first, if that's all right, Cathy. Could you just talk to us a bit about the work we did on monopoly and power? And then I'm going to come to you, Lorne, if I may, to talk about scale and concentration, the recommendations that we've made and where we think that could go. But it is, I stress, these are matters for Parliament, so we advise. We don't have power ourselves. But Cathy, first of all, just the work we did about power imbalances. It's crucially important to understand this point about power.
Sure. So in 2018, we undertook research and we consulted, we spoke to a huge range of people about the experiences and associations of concentrated land ownership across Scotland. And what it really found was that the issues related to concentrated ownership were particularly significant over several areas related to housing, environment, and really it was the control and the influence of the power of the landowner over the community's lives and decisions that was a really strong factor and something that the Commission has set out to address.
Okay, thanks, Cathy. We may well come back to the theme of power, but I'm going to move on to Lorne. But let me just reiterate what I said here, because it's really crucial that we think quite hard about this. There's lots and lots to talk about the unusual pattern of land ownership in Scotland, the concentration, the big holdings, and so on. The work that Cathy referred to in 2018 drilled into that really thoroughly. And it was very, very clear from quite extensive research, which also looked at what other countries do across Europe and beyond, that the central issue is the modification or the modulation of the exercise of power over land use decision making. And that power can be highly significant in quite small areas if there is some form of localized monopoly. And the link's now up there. You can read that work further. as a consequence of that, we made some recommendations on scale of concentration. I'm going to pass to Lorne now. Lorne.
Okay, thanks for that. Yes, we have made recommendations on scale and concentration. Maybe just to say at the outset there, though, that much of our recommendations aren't unusual if you look to the business world and the actual work of the Competition and Markets Authority, which monitors monopolistic behaviour in the business community. So our recommendations that we have put forward to ministers, I think they came out originally in March 2019, and then we did some further work to work them up to a stage where they could potentially be part moving forward to the drafting of a bill. We have suggested there should be the introduction of a public interest test for significant land transfers or acquisitions. I don't think that's much different from what many communities have to do and to prove a case if they're looking forward to a community buyout. So it would be taking very much the example of what's within the powers of the Competition Markets Authority, looking at the various interests of the community in that regard. We've also talked about legislating for a new land rights and responsibilities review process to take effect where there is evidence of adverse impact. And I think the way that that would probably develop is the fact that we have these various protocols that we've talked about good practice in relation to land ownership. But a review could be triggered by a community, for instance, who could say that, you know, that there is a particular issue in their local area, and it would trigger a review when there would be an assessment based on things very closely linked to the land rights and responsibilities about diversification of land ownership, openness, transparency in operation, community engagement, these things, and an assessment would be made. So this is the basis of some of the recommendations going forward. But I would kind of temper all that by saying that, you know, this is not particularly unusual in the regulation of the business world. So I think we can take a kind of example of the similarities with our proposals with those that are already very much accepted powers of the Competition Markets Authority. Only in this instance, we are looking at land ownership. Thanks, Chair.
Lawrence, thank you. So this is a huge area, and there's a lot of work which is being flagged up now in the chat that you can read about it. There are a number of tools. Lawrence just mentioned the main recommendations in the vacant and derelict report. We are now working on tax, and I'm going to come on to that in a minute, Lorne, if you don't mind, because tax is another tool that is potentially available to government. Just before I move on, I just want to refer back to Alistair McIntosh's comment, because he makes another really important point in there, which is the human rights point. The point has often been made in the recent past that interfering in property rights is an interference in human rights. And of course it is, in a sense, because the right to enjoy your property is enshrined in human rights legislation. But there are many other human rights, and sometimes these human rights conflict, or certainly to some extent that there may be a degree of overlap. So real challenges here in doing this work, in finding a balance between the rights, for example, of communities to have a say in things, the rights of people to have access to housing, to employment, all these other human rights, and the right to enjoy your property. And if your right to enjoy your property involves trampling on other people's human rights, then the state needs to intervene. And it's a very difficult but very important discussion. We are now, and I'm going to maybe ask you, Kathy, could you say a very brief word about that? We haven't really started on this yet, but the human rights work that we are going to do to try and tease this out a wee bit, please.
Actually, Andrew, it's one of my colleagues who's leading on this and who will be able to update you on this. So I think there'll be a bit more about this in due course. Yeah.
That's fine, Kathy. And this is where I feel horribly guilty, because I ask people to answer things that there's not their area of expertise. So we have other members of staff who are experts in the human rights area. We also have another board member who is an expert in human rights issues. So they're not here. The work has not yet started, but just to repeat the point, we are very alive to the point inferred or implied in Alistair's point there, that there is very, very clearly a balance to be struck, a human rights balance to be struck here. And we cannot allow property rights to trump other human rights. And that is a big challenge, I think, for the Scottish Parliament and for our society going forward. There are one or two other points about communities and, please define communities and so on. I'm going to come back to that. I think maybe later under the issue of community ownership and community right to buy. But I think it would be helpful. There are one or two other points that are coming up that I haven't managed to touch on. I'm going to touch on them now. The first is, are we doing work on common good land? And the answer is yes, we've done some work. I'm not sure. David, do you want to speak on common good land, or you're going to say no? But you're muted, David. You're muted.
Sorry, I was going to try to say, I think you've got the wrong person again on common good land.
Okay. Well, let me try and see if anyone else wants to. Kathy, do you want to say a quick word on that?
What I'd like to say is actually that there's some really useful resources on our website and a webinar on common good land. I know there's a lot of interest across local authorities and how common good land the potential of common good land to realise wider community benefits. So I think I'd point you in the direction of that webinar in particular, but I think it'll be really interesting to see how the common good land agenda can fit with community wealth building, and how we can ensure that these assets are used for the common good, how it was intended originally, and update it and make it fit for the 21st century, if I can say that.
No, that's fine. So, and Jess has now put up the link to the common good work, or Posey has. So that's great. So we've done some initial work on common good land. It may be that we will do further work and recommend further changes to legislation. It's a very difficult area. So I'll leave that there at the moment. Now, I think I am going to try and pick up on this issue about the relevance of, or how do you translate the scale and concentration work into an urban context? That's the first question. And then secondly, I think we'll move into the whole discussion about community ownership. How might that be made more impactful in again an urban context? David, I think it's reasonable to try you for this one, and we'll see whether that works, please.
Yes, it is. I see people are saying, we're not saying a lot about Glasgow, but actually many of the things we say are applying to cities across Scotland or urban areas across Scotland. I think the comment I'm going to make is not necessarily a Glasgow comment, but one that applies widely and could apply widely. So if we think of scale and concentration in relation to urban areas, the key issue, one of the key issues we have, which I think is not dissimilar to some of the problems we get in the rural parts of Scotland, is the way in which the big house builders tend to monopolize the supply of housing land. And there's actually quite important analogies in terms of power and resources, and quite a lot of work that shows that this is a process that crowds out smaller entrepreneurs, smaller house builders and housing associations. So the Commission has been given a lot of thought to how you try and open up the land market, the housing land market, to a significant number of different players, rather than quite a small number of large house builders. And we are going to be coming forward with recommendations to Scottish ministers of how you might do that. But the key thing in all this is the process by which land passes from the original owner to the developer, because often that is a process that is not particularly transparent at all. For example, a lot of land is held under what are called options, land options, and if you could calculate all those, you would find that there are monopoly effects in the same way that there are monopoly effects on rural land. And I think we need to bring similar kinds of mechanisms in play in terms of greater concentration and in terms of abilities to ensure, should we say, more competition within the land market, so that all kinds of different players, including perhaps self-build entrepreneurs, have a better chance of finding land, and that it's not concentrated in the big players. And I haven't time to go on, but actually that then has a knock-on effect in terms of the number of homes that are built, the speed of homes, the variety of homes, and the quality of homes. So I think that's where the principles of scale and concentration apply as much to urban areas as to rural areas.
David, thanks. Let's hear from Cathy on the same theme, and then Lauren, I'm going to ask you about community ownership in these areas. But I think it'd be useful just to hear from Cathy a bit more on the whole business of, if you like, power and land ownership in an urban context, where you're not talking about someone owning hundreds of thousands of acres, but you, David started us off. Could you add to that, and then I'll come to you, Lauren?
Yeah, I think this is where the land rights and responsibilities, the principles come in, and the need to, for example, engage with communities on decisions about place. I think an important way to tackle decision-making power is to bring communities on board and actually ensure they're part of that decision-making process. So referring back to the community engagement point from earlier, I think the tools and approaches we have to support that are really key. So that's just another example of how that dynamic is relevant to an urban context and to built environments.
Yep.
Okay, Cathy. Lauren, just before we talk about community ownership, sorry, I just want to because there's quite a lot of sort of frustration in the chat about which is about communities. Either it's about transparency, it's about people not being engaged, it's there's Matthew's quite long point, you know, a sense of frustration with the local authority, and one or two other points in there. This sense of people being disengaged comes up. It's a rural and an urban issue, Cathy or David. We've produced protocols. The 2016 Act talks about it. The reality is that the frustration is still there. We have begun to think about the parallels with the tenant farming commissioner's role, where there are statutory arrangements for codes of practice and statutory arrangements for investigating where owners of land do not follow those codes of practice. Of course, that's a matter for Parliament, it's not for us, but some thoughts on, I don't know if you want to offer, well, maybe Lauren, you could kick this one off, but just some thoughts on, so how might we move from a protocol-based approach, which is clearly not dealing with all the frustrations, to one that is more code-based, more robust, and then please move on to your experience of community ownership in urban contexts.
Yeah, I think I may have covered some of that already when I was just talking about the similarities with the work of the Tenant Farming Commissioner, who has actual codes that are underpinned by legislation and can actually make a consideration on a potential breach and offer a penalty. Perhaps if our protocols move forward to have a legal underpinning, for instance, the one on community engagement and decisions relating to land, then rather than being a protocol, which is best practice and encouraged, we would move to a situation where it would be expected of landowners to have that kind of level of engagement. But kind of moving on to community ownership in the urban setting, we see that much of the community ownership is of a different nature, understandably, to the rural areas where there are large parcels of land that have been taken over by communities. There has been a great deal of interest, and indeed a growing interest, from urban communities in purchasing a building to develop for use in the community, or some land for whether that's allotments or some community space, developing recreation facilities and various things. Prior to the first lockdown, we held a board meeting, Scottish Land Commission, at the Barmulloch Community Centre in Glasgow, which I think we all found extremely interesting to see the ambition and the opportunities that have been created by community land ownership in Barmulloch, and looking to perhaps further developments in due course. But as I maybe highlighted earlier on in the presentation, the Community Land Scotland, which is a representative body for community landowners in Scotland, has specifically set up a community ownership hub focusing on Glasgow and the Clyde Valley. And I think flagged up that the website communityownership.scot. So, please look at that, because there is advice and help available for community groups in Glasgow and the surrounding area to take forward their ambitions. There is a lot of legislation there that helps. That there is the asset transfer legislation. So if a community is wishing to acquire land that perhaps is currently in public ownership, then there is a process that can be followed there. And again, I know that David flagged up the community right to buy for abandoned, neglected land, but I would also add, under the 2016 Act, there is a community right to buy. This is a right, even though the land might not be on the market, for the purchase of land to further sustainable development. And there are opportunities there for communities to become involved. So there is a wide level of opportunities there. There is a growing interest in the urban areas, and I would encourage you to maybe get involved and approach the Community Ownership Hub. Thank you.
No, thank you. Let's move this slightly on. Alistair McIntosh, thank you, Alistair. Really helpfully sort of shunting this conversation on a bit, but very much linking it. We've for quite some time in Scotland now, we've understood that we need to develop more empowered communities who can do things for themselves, fix things for themselves, develop things for themselves. And we've had the Community Empowerment Act and all the rest of it. And community ownership of land and community development land is part of that. So is the community engagement intentions in the 2016 Act. And it is definitely working in some places. You can see extraordinary things happening in some communities. But it is definitely not working in other places. And there's a lot of discussion about capacity building and resource and all the rest of it. And clearly at a time of very constrained public resources, that's going to be challenging. But I think it's worth just exploring this a little bit more. Bear in mind the Land Commission is very much focusing its advice on land and issues to do with ownership of land and land use decision making. So it's a broader subject than that, capacity building. But David, you have quite a bit of experience, not least from your own community, of this whole business of community empowerment, capacity building, and you've seen how Community Land Scotland has done things and so on. Do you want to offer some thoughts? I mean, in a way, Alistair set it out in that point in the chat.
I think my own experience is that people have got to believe that some positive outcome can be achieved to commit a huge amount of time and resources to get involved. People have got to have a vision and see that it's actually practical. And that's partly about the practicalities of things. It's partly about the personalities. I think it's also about the support that communities get from local authorities and from other bodies to ease the way through the process and not put barriers in their way. I have to say my own experience would be that the hoops you have to jump through, set up through the legislation, certainly if you're going to go down the community right to buy route, are really quite off-putting, are almost set up from the perspective of officialdom rather than the perspective of communities. And it's almost as if officials sort of don't realize that people in communities are doing this often in spare time, very hard pressed time, and are not permanently employed to work through the bureaucracy. So, I mean, the Commission has been looking at how all those routes could be simplified, and there are discussions still going on. But I think it's something we probably have to return to, because we have to try and make it as easy as possible if people do get involved to achieve something positive, because unless there's that momentum and there is a belief that something can be achieved, then enthusiasm will very quickly drop away. And I do worry that all the steps and all the hoops that communities have to go through are actually quite off-putting, particularly to communities in less well-off areas.
Thanks, David. So it is challenging, but let's not talk ourselves down here. Cups can be half full and half empty. There are some extraordinary things happening around Scotland in really quite small and often not particularly affluent communities. Just as there are a lot of people getting exceedingly frustrated, and I can see in the chat there's one from Norman there that expresses that frustration. But let's not, I think it is extraordinary what is being achieved as well as the level of challenge. We will continue where we think that there are ways that things can be streamlined through on the community right to buy or anywhere else. We continue to advise government. We need to recognise, certainly on things like right to buy, that there is a balance there of human rights, between people's right to their property and other rights. So it isn't easy. But I wouldn't want people to go away from this meeting and think that it's all just too difficult, because the evidence is that actually that's not true, and people have and are achieving some fantastic things. Just before we leave this subject, and I need to watch the time, but I just want to come back to you, Lorne. Can you just give us an example from an urban situation of a community that's done some fantastic things? I think it'd be really helpful to do that.
Yeah, I think there are so many community buyouts that have taken place. There's Action Porty over in Edinburgh, and indeed the Barmulloch one we just talked about there. I think it was actually a purchase of a kind of boxing club and various other things within the city itself. But I think it's also about empowerment, and it's what happens next when a community has actually come together to take forward a development. Then perhaps they have aspirations to do other things. And I think it's the legacy that is left in communities thereafter, in terms of people who actually know how to bring people together, how to negotiate, how to take things forward, to do business planning, to operate successful enterprises, community enterprises at the end of the day. And I think that's all extremely positive. Now, Andrew, can I actually take the opportunity here? I was just seeing some in the chat to just maybe talk a wee bit about tax, because I think that's an important part. I see Callum Patterson and other people just asking questions about land value tax. So I think just as time is going on, can I just flag up that another important piece of work that we are doing at the moment, and indeed we have another meeting of our tax advisory group, expert advisory group tomorrow. Tax obviously has a great influence on land and how it is used. and the interactions with the people that are living around it. But one of the things that we are looking at specifically is some short-term tax proposals in a post-COVID situation there. So we're looking at, which is very, very important to Glasgow and to other cities and towns throughout Scotland, is looking at how we might use tax to avoid further areas of land coming onto the vacant and derelict land register, how to help recovery in city centres, town centres, in terms of regeneration of retail spaces or transfers to other activities, whether that's housing development or whatever else, but to keep the vibrancy of our town centres. So we're looking at various things there. Tax, we're also looking at council tax, non-domestic rates, in moving to look at things like diversification of land ownership or concentrated land ownership. We are indeed, I'm looking at the chat here, the comments there about things like land and building transaction tax, which is something that is within Holyrood powers, to look at perhaps the opportunity to look at an additional supplement for land ownership of scale that may be of a concentrated land ownership. So there are a wide plethora of things that we're looking at in relation to tax, and there will be a report going to the Commission over the summer, and then we hopefully will be able to publish our proposals to government by the end of the summer, coming into the autumn. So that's an important piece of our work. So thanks for just the chance to talk about that and highlight that. Thanks, Andrew.
Lauren, thanks. That was next on my list anyway, so that's great. Thank you. I'd like us to talk a wee bit more about tax, because it is a really important potential tool in land reform in a number of different ways. On the chat, we've seen reference to land value tax, and I think we should possibly just say a little bit more about our thinking on that. But land taxation is quite a multidimensional, potentially quite a multidimensional subject. It could be used in all sorts of ways. And some of those taxes are reserved to Westminster, so it may clearly much more difficult for the Scottish Government to do something, but that doesn't stop us giving advice. We can give advice that is to Westminster. Cathy, you've also been very involved in the tax. I wonder if you would want to say something. I think it would be particularly helpful to people if you could sort of give a practical illustration of how tax might be used to drive outcomes, desirable outcomes.
Yeah, I think going back to Lorne's point about some of the options we have to use tax as one of our sort of policy tools to address town centre dereliction and vacancy. So clearly the way the pandemic has shaped the way we work and we shop, and there is potentially a fear that sites will become abandoned and neglected, and we want to avoid this creation of a new legacy of derelict land and an empty and unused building. So I think there's potential there to actually prevent that from happening, and encouraging landowners to put that into productive use rather than letting a site sit abandoned and let it get discounts for being vacant and derelict. And I think we can change our mindset there about how we can use tax to address that specifically. I mean, there are other countries that have got a type of tax on land values. So we've done research in 2018 to look at that. It's important to recognise that land value tax shouldn't just seen as a single tax, but there are different types of land value taxes, as that international sort of scoping exercise shows. So I think these are all things we're actively working on and we need to bear in mind going forward. So yeah, that's where we are. We're actually working on it right now. So the proposals should be published over the summer.
Thanks, Cathy. Now, we've got about 15 minutes left. I'm going to come back, I think, probably to housing, because it's come up in the chat a number of times. I do just want to pick up on one of the very early points in the chat, which I made a note of, and that's the question. There was a question, I can't remember exactly what it said, but it was, what are we doing in relation to rights of access? So just to be clear, we are not working on access rights. Nature Scot, or what was Scottish Natural Heritage, is the government's advisor on access rights, and therefore that sits with them. You'll be well aware that rights were put in place in 2003. They're working reasonably well. There are some problems. I can't help but tweet about them occasionally, and there's certainly some things to be done there. But that work is with Nature Scot, so I'm not going to talk about that further. What I would like, though, is to come back to the issue of housing, Cathy, because I think there's a frustration in here. It's not all about housing by any means, but could you just say a wee bit more about the housing work? It's coming to a conclusion now. We will be publishing further, but particularly, I mean, can you just draw out for people, what are the key messages for Glasgow from the housing work? Can you do that for us?
Yeah, so it's an area I'm not working that closely on, so I might have to bring in David Adams at some point as well.
Yeah, I mean, by all means, we'll bring David in, but could you want to kick it off, and I'll see if I can. We'll do our best with this.
Yes, just to put it into context, the Land Commission is looking at how land for housing comes forward and ensuring that the land market works more in the public interest, so that housing is delivered where people need it, and at prices that people can afford. And I think there's a really important role for us to look at different approaches. So we've taken an international perspective on things, so looking at examples across Europe as for how land for housing comes forward for development, and to perhaps remove some of the speculation market. So I think that's where we're at the moment. We're just producing some, we're undertaking the review, and we're due to publish proposals, but my colleagues more up to date on these things than me, but David might want to come in.
Yeah, I think if we're going to grant in Glasgow, I mean, let's talk about Crown Street in the Gorbals. So that probably is one of the model developments that have taken place in Glasgow in the last 20, 30 years, and widely applauded, the redevelopment there. So that would be a very good example of what Cathy was talking about, what we call public interest-led development. And what was crucial to that development was not, I mean, the planning and the master plans were essential, but actually the public control of the land ownership and the way in which that was then used to procure a whole series of different developers, but on a condition that they kept and built to the master plan. So there's a variety of different types of housing, both in terms of design, but also in terms of tenure. And there's generally, I think it's fair to say, a much significantly better public realm than in many speculative developments elsewhere in Glasgow. So that would be an example that we've tried to take forward in the housing work of how do you get more developments like Crown Street in Glasgow or elsewhere, and how do you get, should we say, less soulless estates that you find on the edge or in many places in Scotland. And that is, as I say, it's about tying together the ownership of the land with the way in which development contracts are procured, and the way that is then related in a joined up way to master planning. And as Cathy says, that as well as looking at the experience in Scotland, which we have done, there's actually a very good experience in a European context that we've looked at, that can be brought to bear to deliver, I think, both better quality housing, but also, interestingly enough, more affordable and homes actually being delivered quicker. So it's really about the processes by which housing is procured, and not just about sort of the planning allocations. Thanks.
David, thank you. It's a huge challenge for Scotland. It's a huge priority for all political parties to address the housing crisis in Scotland. There's an awful lot of people trying extremely hard. It isn't easy, and it is costly. I want to respond to Susan Carrick. Susan, I did mention climate change at the beginning, but I'll try and do it again. I'm sorry. The whole question of how land is used, clearly land use and climate action, if I can use that term, are closely linked, and particularly in rural areas, the way in which land is used and its impact, positive or negative, on climate action are closely linked. Let's be clear. The job of the Land Commission, as Lauren set out at the beginning, is essentially about the way in which land is owned and the processes by which land use decisions are made. It is not about determining what those decisions should be. There are plenty of other people doing that. So the key lever we will have in relation to climate action and the climate emergency will be to ensure that land use decisions are being made by the people of Scotland as a whole, by local communities as a whole, and in the public interest. That's the challenge for us, and that we do not continue to have land use decision-making processes which can be driven by one person, usually a man, in his personal interest or her personal interest, regardless of the consequences. That's where the link is to climate change. We are not it is not our role to say you should do this or you should do that, plant trees or dig up peat or whatever it is. I hope that helps. I'm sorry if you felt I didn't respond before. Now, time getting quite tight, so I'm just going to access. I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the point being made about access, but it is essentially nature, Scott. I'll read it later, sorry. Yeah, understand the point about zero carbon. So look, I think we've probably just about covered things. I'm just going to come back around the three panel members who may want to add any further thoughts. Please, anybody and everybody on this call, please add any further last thoughts onto the chat. It's a great way of everyone hearing your thoughts, or reading your thoughts rather. But let's just go around. So Lauren, just any last thoughts on things you've heard, particularly just linking our work to the very real land-related challenges in Glasgow.
Yep, thanks for that. I think it's been really interesting. I'm trying my best to kind of keep up with the chat there, but you know, I am like yourself. I do pick up a frustration there. Maybe, you know, something we need to take away is to you know, have a interaction with Glasgow City Council about much of our work there. I think that would be helpful, just to you know, to build up kind of relationships and just to discuss our work programme over the next 3 years. But I think this is an exciting time for communities and urban communities. I think the opportunities are there to take forward proposals, hopefully to look at the perspective of purchase of properties that maybe are useful to communities, but also to tackle dereliction and also to stem any decline in our city centres post-COVID, in the post-COVID recovery. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done. I think there is a great relevance to land reform in the urban setting. But I'll just kind of leave it there just now. Andrew, back to you.
Thanks very much. Kathy, any last thoughts from you?
Yes, I mean, I think the point made about embedding land rights and responsibilities in an urban context is crucial, and we are working with public and private landowners and local authorities. So that's very much part of our programme, to ensure that all these principles are embedded in their practice. So that goes back to good stewardship, preventing land from becoming abandoned and neglected. So we're actively working on that. And then I just saw the question from Ewan about access in urban areas. So we are working on, we're part of a public health group that is looking at ways we can use vacant and derelict land to open up access for recreational uses, and that's something that's come up, and I think we can actually use naturalised spaces, vacant land, to better serve communities, to put in access, and something that's come across quite strongly from that group is that not all green space is quality and accessible green space. So that's, you know, we're aware of this, and it's definitely an access issue, and so we're part of those conversations as well.
Thanks, Kathy. And you and I have now finally managed to properly read and understand your point, which I now get. So thank you for that. Sorry, it's really difficult to do it, to juggle all these balls. David, some last thoughts for you.
Yeah, I'm looking at the chat, and it's been really very wide-ranging. I'm conscious that within the time available, we can only respond to some of it. But there's just stepping back, I think there's a number of issues there that raise the question around the meaning of value in relation to land, or what determines value, because often value is determined in a very narrow way in terms of financial value, and it's determined by whoever owns the land, whether it's the council or whether it's a private owner. And actually, value is much broader, particularly in urban areas, elsewhere, but particularly in urban areas. And land can have value, but it may not necessarily have a strong market value. So the points being raised about green space are really important. How do we protect green space in urban areas from all the green space being captured and built upon by property developers? And one thing that we are doing, just to conclude, is we are beginning a piece of work that's looking at the issue of valuation and the difference between what one might call market value, in other words, what things would be bought or sold for in a transaction, and much wider, let's say, real value, taking account of all the other factors. And I think this actually, Andrew, also relates to the issue of power within urban areas, because often it's a very small number of people who determine what the value is. So whilst we've not gone into that in any depth at all, I think it does relate to a number of questions that we haven't been able to address, but are really quite important in Glasgow.
David, thank you. Okay, 2 minutes to left, so I'm going to just wrap it up. But thank you all. There's still lots of things coming in the chat, which is brilliant. Thank you very much indeed for that. And I can't read them all right at the moment, but I will certainly read them before we close this. Just a couple of final thoughts from me. This is a hugely complex subject. Land Commission was set up really quite recently. It's got sorting out priorities was a real challenge. We cannot do everything at once. And we need to remember that before 1999, Scotland actually didn't have any say over land reform or land legislation or anything else in Scotland. It was all determined from Westminster, with the House of Lords then sometimes interjecting as well. So it's quite early days, and in many ways what Scotland, I think, is doing at the moment is to some extent catching up. And it's very interesting how much of our work we very deliberately look across the channel and learn from other parts of Europe, from Scandinavia, from Germany, from the Netherlands, and so on and so forth. And that, I think, tells you something about Scotland doing a catching up job. But Scotland is also, in some ways, ahead of the game. We are seen within Europe as one of the most liberal and most forward thinkers on access, for example. And increasingly, we're seen as driving a community ownership agenda that is really exciting. So Scotland is moving very, very fast. We are now heading towards a further land reform bill, which will be, I think, the third since 1999, or the fourth, I forget which. And that makes things very exciting. We're also in a time where land reform has a high priority in political terms. You saw it in manifestos, you hear it in discussion. So I'm expecting that change will continue, and continue fast, and continue in a very demanding way. And that doesn't mean it will be easy. That doesn't mean it will suddenly become simple. That does not mean there will suddenly become easy answers and free lunches. It will continue to be very, very difficult to do. But I'm extraordinarily optimistic about where this is all going. So please share in that. Please articulate your frustrations, but also please recognize that this world is rapidly changing, and the world that my children and grandchildren inherit will be very, very different to the one that I inherited, which was actually very different to the one that my father and grandfather inherited, and they were both involved in land reform last century. At this point in a public meeting, normally I would close the meeting and then talk to people privately who would come and tell me all the things, either specifics, as we've seen in some of the chat, or the things they didn't want to say publicly, which there are also often quite a few of those. We can't do that, and I'm really sorry. So what we've done instead is we've just put up on the chat an email address. Please, if you want to make specific points to me or to anyone else, please use the email address and email us. It is a confident, we will not share it. I'm perfectly willing to phone people if they want to talk about things and they don't want to commit it to email. And I've done that after a number of these public meetings online. There's no reason why that shouldn't happen. If you email in with a phone number and the gist of what you want to talk about, I'll give you a ring. Happy to do that. So I hope that's helpful. The other thing I would ask you to do is please use the website that we've developed over the last 3 years. It's a fantastic resource. There is a vast amount of good stuff there. Please use it. It's not the sort of thing you can scan in 5 minutes. It'll take you a long time. But there's already a tremendous wealth of stuff there. And we will continue to add to that and develop it and polish it as we go. And there's a website address just now coming up. Wow, Posey, well done. Her timing was immaculate there. Thank you for that. There's the website up there. So thank you all again for joining us. I really do very much appreciate it. I very much hope that the next public meeting in Glasgow is a proper one where we're face to face. I much prefer that kind of thing. But in the meantime, have a safe journey to your fridge or your kettle or whatever it is that you're going to do. And thank you again. Good night to all of you. Thank you.